Welcome back, everyone. We've got another day now on Plato's Apology about the trial of Socrates. I'll give you a quick recap of what we covered last time, and then we'll get into the newer aspects of this reading. So, one reason I'm giving you a recap is because remember what I said last time, that in philosophy almost all the ideas are somehow connected to each other. It's not just that Socrates says this idea, then later on he says some other idea. It's that the later idea somehow builds upon or proves the earlier idea. They build on each other. And this is part of what differentiates philosophy from mere opinion. When people have opinions or feelings, they're usually sort of disconnected. The person will loudly declare the feeling, but if you ask them why, they can't necessarily connect it to some other idea. They know for sure how they feel, but they're not necessarily sure where that feeling comes from or what else it connects to. But in philosophy, what we try to do is we try to connect all of our ideas. And the reason we do that is because if you've got a good idea, or in terms of Socrates, if you've got an idea which you can get other people to agree with you on, and then you connect that to some other idea that you're not so sure about, or that you can't get everyone to so easily agree on, you've supported that second idea, that harder to understand or more controversial idea. If you can connect it to an idea which is easily understood and less controversial, then you've given support for the tougher idea. Right? That will be more convincing to other people, and it also helps you have more faith that your ideas are true because you've connected them to support. Okay. So, all that said, that's part of why I recap, is because most of what we did last time is necessary to understand what happens today. Okay. So, the recap is this. Socrates has been charged with false crimes. He says the reason that he was charged with these, even though he's not guilty of these charges, is basically because he has annoyed people. He's made a bunch of enemies in his city. So how did Socrates annoy people? What did he do that annoyed them so much that they dragged him into court? Well, he asked them philosophical questions. And we saw that method of how exactly he does that when he was cross-examining Meletus at the end of the reading last time. Okay, that's the standard Socrates way to ask philosophy questions. Okay, so why do they get annoyed with questions? Well, the questions show what they do and do not know. And while most people will loudly proclaim what they do know, they don't want proclaimed in public what they don't know. So Socrates shows, with Meletus specifically, he showed that he didn't know what was good and bad for the youth, which was the whole claim behind him prosecuting Socrates for being bad to the youth, for corrupting them. So that makes Meletus sort of look silly, right? Well, nobody likes to be made to look silly. That's why people are mad with Socrates. And in his defense, though, he says, look, I don't go out of my way to prove that other people are ignorant. When they declare that they know something, I will ask them only about that thing they said they know about. And so if they're embarrassed when they're shown not to know what they claim they know, he said they're the ones who actually embarrass themselves by pretending they know something they don't. Don't kill the messenger. I merely showed the embarrassing way that they actually already were. Right? He didn't make them bad. They made themselves bad. He just reveals it. Okay. Last time we talked about how Socrates was inspired to do this because there was a religious prophecy or oracle that told him that he was the wisest. That's the origin of this. And then we saw it in the present when he was cross-examining Meletus. Okay. Let's see. What else? Right. A final thing towards the very end of what we read last time is that Socrates says, I know that what I've been doing in the past, telling people in public what they do and don't know, or showing in public, got me into trouble earlier. And he says, I know it got me into trouble. It's what got me into this trial here today. And yet he still does it in the trial as well. So he says, I know what has made me unpopular outside of the court. Doing that same thing here in the court is going to make me, is going to keep me unpopular. And that this might lead to my downfall or my harm. Okay. So Socrates knows that the truth of his innocence still might not save him. And that's basically where we left off last time. Remember, all this is connected. Socrates knows that even though he has the truth on his side, many people have not the truth, but persuasion of false beliefs. And that's what rules the masses. That's what rules the fellow citizens who are ruling on the punishment of Socrates. And that's today's real theme. Okay, that's the content for today. Okay. So Socrates on page 9, this is all new content, okay? Socrates on page 9 says, I bet you and the jury have this question for me, Socrates. I bet the jury's thinking about Socrates. Still, Socrates, you should be ashamed to have done whatever made people want to drag you into court today. You should have done something different because you should have known that this was dangerous and you should avoid it. And Socrates says, actually, you're wrong. Danger is not always to be avoided. It's not always a good idea or a good thing to avoid danger. So remember, it's a standard philosophy thing when we've got a controversial or disagreed upon claim, like whether what Socrates does is good or bad, whether he should be ashamed of it or not. We can move to a related question that we can agree on and see if that applies to the harder question, okay? So Socrates says, the jury probably thinks that I should have acted differently to avoid danger, and I disagree. Let's move to something we can agree on. He says, I bet you all agree that the Greek warriors who fought in Troy were running a risk, that it was dangerous. And I bet you also agree that they should have run that risk, that it was good that they faced danger in that way. He says, when the warriors in Troy stood their ground and were killed because of it, you praise them as heroes. We all agree on that, correct? Everyone would agree on that. Then he says, well, you're now telling me that I should step down from a danger. I should betray my ideals because I'm in danger. Whereas when other people stuck to their ideals when they're in danger, you called them heroes. But now you say that what I'm doing is bad, even though they did the same exact thing and you called it good. You see that? That's very much a Socrates move, and it's very much a philosophy move in general. If you say that this thing is bad for this reason, because it is dangerous, and then you say this other thing is good, despite it having the exact same kind of danger, you seem to be saying opposite things. So unless you can show where the difference is, we have to assume these two things are similar, and that Socrates is a philosophical hero in the same way that Achilles was a hero of Troy. Okay? If you have any questions about how that works and how that sort of metaphor or analogy to warriors works, please send me an email and we can talk about it. Okay, so I'm going to step back and say why this is important. The normal stuff, okay, he showed them to be a contradiction. Contradictions can't be true. We got that. Here's something else I'd like to add. You guys have all heard of the Trojan War, okay? I bet a bunch of you have even seen the movie with Brad Pitt in it where he plays Achilles, one of the main heroes of this war, okay? I bet a bunch of you have seen the movie 300 as well, right? Where the Spartans face down their enemies. It was very dangerous what they did. They knew they were going to die, but they did it to stand up for their city and the people they loved. Okay, those things, the Trojan War was a really long time ago. Well before Socrates. And the Spartan War was closer to Socrates' time. That makes it about 2,500 years ago. Okay, here's the point. We still talk about the Trojan War We still make movies about these warriors today. Okay, we still think there's something important about them. They're worth remembering. And they're not anonymous. We know their names. Okay? Part of what I want to say here is that there are many ways to be remembered. There are many ways to avoid living a boring, anonymous life. One is to be a famous warrior. Another one, though, is what Socrates did. You may or may not like Socrates from this reading, but people still talk about him today. People still hold him up as a hero today, in the same way that they still talk about the famous Spartan 300 and the heroes of the Trojan War. Do you know any of the names of the jury members who convicted Socrates? No. They're dead and forgotten. Do you know the names of any of the people who stayed home instead of going and fighting the Trojan War? Probably not. We don't make movies about the jury members, the common people, who are persuaded of false beliefs. We make movies, we read books, people write books about those who stand out and do something unique and rise above being part of the anonymous mass. Okay? The mass says, I don't want to do anything strange, unusual, or dangerous. And Socrates says, you're never going to be remembered, you're never going to lead a life worth leading if you always avoid what is unpopular or dangerous. So that's pretty inspiring here. That's the kind of meaning behind this simple comparison to the heroes in Troy. Okay, it's a lesson that philosophy can give you. It may be an idea you've thought of before, but it gives it a different twist on it, and it gives a sort of argument or proof behind it. Socrates is saying, among other things, if you want to live a life that's worthy of remembrance, that people will talk about once you're gone, you have to do something unusual. That means you have to have unusual values. And where did Socrates get his unusual values from? From philosophy. It's not the only way to do it. Achilles wasn't a philosopher, but it is one way to do it. If you want to set yourself up as a unique, rare, and impressive person, philosophy is one way to do that. Okay, moving on to the next point. This is page 10. Socrates says, I don't fear death. Now, if he stopped right there, that would just be an opinion. Do I like death or dislike it? Oh, neither. I don't think it's anything to fear or dislike, neither. That would just be a statement, a preference, or a feeling, or an opinion. But you already know, I've told you, philosophy is not opinion. It always goes beyond opinion and leaves opinion behind. So once more, merely saying I fear death or don't fear death is a statement of preference, opinion, viewpoint, feeling, whatever. He, though, as a philosopher, always goes beyond that. That is, he goes beyond a statement of opinion by giving reasons for his view. So he says, I don't fear death because I don't know what it is. It's such a standard Socrates thing. He loves to tell you, because he's modest, what he does not know. So he says, I don't actually know what death is. I've never been dead before, right? He's like, I've never been dead before. I haven't talked to a lot of dead people. Don't really know what it is. So he says, why would you base behaviors or feelings like fear and behaviors like trying to avoid it on something you don't understand? I don't fear the country of Croatia because I don't know anything about it. Why would I fear something that I don't know anything about? Okay? Now, we're going to return to this at the end of the reading in a very interesting, complex way. Okay? Just put a pin in that for now. Socrates says, I don't fear death and I have a good reason. That is philosophy beyond opinion. He says, I don't think it's wise to fear things that you don't understand. Okay? Now, adding to this point, I want to ask you something. Not a discussion question, but just sort of a rhetorical question. Do you fear death? Okay, I think most people fear death. And there are some people who don't fear death, but it's not natural, right? I think it's probably natural for all people to fear death. And if you don't fear it, it's because you somehow changed over time to get away from your natural fear. That would be my guess, okay? Well, for Socrates, it's the same. Something happened that made him not fear death. And once more, that was philosophy. Philosophy is what happened to him. Philosophy is what taught him that he didn't need to fear death. Okay? Ideas made Socrates free from the fear of death. Think about how powerful this is. Almost everyone is afraid of death. Almost no one is unafraid of death. So Socrates has done something very unusual. Also, it's something very powerful. The fear of death is a strong fear. It really puts, it's really a bummer, I guess I'd say. It really puts a damper on many people's lives. Socrates is free of that fear, that anxiety, that worry. And philosophy is what set him free in that way. The truth set him free. Again, I'm trying to point out some of the value of philosophy, the power of philosophy in some of our readings, so that beyond knowing what Socrates thought and why he thought it, you can understand the importance of thinking such ideas. I mean, to me, it's just quite impressive that fear, which is strong, which is nearly universal, so it's almost in everybody, and can really touch every aspect of your life. If something can set you free from that fear that almost everyone else has, and that can really almost ruin your life, that's something very powerful and good. I'd love to be fully free from that fear myself. Well, Socrates got free of that through philosophy. Okay, it's very impressive. So, moving on, another point here. Do you remember last class that I told you that the original etymology, so the sort of study of words, the etymological meaning of the word philosophy is love of wisdom. Phil means love, so Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. Philanthropy is the love of mankind, so you do charity because you love mankind. And sophos means wisdom or knowledge, basically. Okay, everybody has knowledge. Some people have more, some people have less. Okay, but what would it mean not just to have knowledge, but to love it? Capital L, love wisdom. To devote your life to wisdom. Right? If wisdom was your primary motivation, your primary directive, right? What would that look like? Well, this is part of why we're reading the Apology about the life of Socrates. If you want to know what life looks like when you love wisdom above all other things, you need look no further than the life of Socrates. Okay? On page 11, he says, I know I annoy you people of the jury with the way I am. And he says, so maybe you would say, stop annoying us and we won't punish you. And he says, I love the offer, thank you, but I can't. He says, my whole life is built around this one thing. This is a quote on page 11. He says, as long as I draw breath and am able to do so, I shall not cease to practice philosophy. I shall not cease to love wisdom, is what that would mean. He can't stop. If any of you are in love right now, if someone just said, well, you know, you've got a trial coming up, you should really stop loving this person, you couldn't just turn it off and on at will, right? Or if you love your parents, you couldn't just choose to stop loving them tomorrow, could you? Same thing if you're on the outs with your parents. Some people have very rough relationships with their parents. You might not just be able to stop and forgive them on a dime tomorrow. So this is what a capital L love means for most people, but definitely for Socrates. It's not just an opinion he has. It's not just something he picked up from other people. It's not just something he does sometimes and then stops sometimes. And it's not just ideas he has. It's not just things he thinks are true. It motivates his action, and it consistently motivates his action. His love of wisdom, that is philosophy, is for him a total way of life. It infuses and enriches every aspect of his life, just like love does. When you love someone, you think about them all the time. You would do almost anything for them. And they give your life meaning. Well, Socrates loves wisdom in that same kind of real love, capital L love way. Okay? Now, on page 11 here, he says this. He says, I cannot cease to practice philosophy. That is, I cannot cease to love wisdom. I cannot live in a different way. So even if they said, we will stop punishing you, if you stop philosophizing, he says, I cannot stop loving philosophy. I cannot stop practicing wisdom. Then he goes on and he contrasts what he loves with what many others love. Money and reputation are two things he points to. For reputation, I know you know what that means, but to link it to how we would talk today, popularity is basically what he means there. Okay? So he says, I love wisdom, I philosophize. Most other people love money or popularity. And he says they love money or popularity instead of, quote, wisdom or truth or the best possible state of their soul, end quote. Okay? So we're going to take a pause here in a moment. I'm going to ask you some of your discussion questions, and then we'll stop this part of the recording. We'll start up to finish the reading. Okay? But just let this sink in for a second. Just give it a moment, and if you feel like it, go ahead and pause the recording just to reflect on this for a second. Okay, so now I want to ask you discussion questions. And remember, discussion questions are that I take something from the reading to sort of give a foundation for the question, but I always do want you to answer as yourself. You don't need to just tell me what the reading says. So answer as yourself. But think about yourself in terms of the reading, okay? So yes, answer the question as yourself, but then think of that. Think about the reading then to see what that might say about yourself, your own answer. Okay? I really, if I met you in 5 years and you forgot everything about the readings, but you did think about yourself in new and different ways because of the readings, I would be happy, right? So we have to do the readings so that we can better think about ourselves, but the point is to think about ourselves through the readings, not just know what the readings said. So that means it's both. It's not without the readings, but it's not only about the readings. Okay, so the discussion question, the first one I want to ask you is this. Okay, Socrates has defined himself as driven by the love of wisdom. Okay, that's his definition. He is a philosopher. He is a lover of wisdom at his core. Okay, so step one of this first question. How would you define yourself? Okay, through love, as in what we've just been talking about, or the care that we talked about in the day before. Okay, what love or thing you care for matters most to you and defines you the most? So that's step one of this question. Pause and jot down what you think, what love or care, concern for you think defines you. Go ahead and pause the recording now for that, please. Okay, now here's step two. Remember yesterday, Melodus claimed that he had a care motivating him, that he cared for the youth and their improvement. But then he showed by what he knows about and how he acts that he in fact doesn't care about the youth and their improvement. Remember, because Socrates says, well, what improves the youth? And he gave a contradictory, therefore not true answer about it, and showed that he'd never really thought about what corrupted or improved the youth. So he can't really care about something he's never thought about, right? So step 2, what in your knowledge or actions either supports that you do in fact care and love this thing, or is there anything in your life that sort of pushes the other way, that shows that you may not care or love this thing more than everything else? Okay? So that's step 2. Again, step 1 was, how would you define yourself? What's the thing that matters the most to you, that you love or care for the most? Step 2 is there anything in your behavior or knowledge or actions that shows that maybe you care about something else more than this thing? Okay? And then a final sort of step 3, if there's any difference between these things, what could bring them closer? What could make your ideal love or care and your actual behavior, what could bring them closer together? What could align them or make them non-contradictory? Okay, so pause the recording now and answer those questions, please. So, do you see with that question how we're using the book to ask ourselves important questions about ourselves? But it doesn't matter if your answer is the same as Socrates, right? It doesn't matter if you two would disagree. You just want to use what makes sense in the reading to pose a question to yourself, but it's not necessary that you answer that question in the identical way that the reading would. Okay? So now we're on to a second question. Okay? This one will go a little quicker because it doesn't have so many parts. The second question is that Socrates says on page 16, this is a very famous quote from Socrates. He says, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Okay. On page 11, he also says that truth and the best possible state of the soul are the same thing. So to have knowledge is to be a good person. So the question here is, do you agree that the unexamined life is not worth leading? Another way to put that is, do you agree that a life that is ignorant of many things is a less good life? Another way to put that is, since Socrates identifies truth and knowing, says that they're the same thing as having a good soul or being a good person, do you think that truth is useful for being a good person? Do knowledge and goodness somehow reinforce each other or come together? Okay. What do you think about that? Pause the recording and reflect on that question. Okay, so now that you've jotted down some thoughts for one or both of those questions, because remember, you don't have to answer every question I ask you, okay? But now that I've asked you some questions, given you some food for thought, we will end this recording here, come back with a little bit more to wrap up the reading, draw all these different ideas together. Okay, thank you, everyone.